As a musician and conductor, I've grown up hearing the violin concertos known as the Four Seasons. I hear it all the time, and in all sorts of places. It's used as background music in lifts, airports, restaurants, and supermarkets. They play it to cheer you up at a subconscious level and to make you feel good about shopping and spending cash. This is great music, thrown away by being played on tinny tannoys which make it sound muffled and dull. But the real thing is so much better.
I'm very familiar with the sound of it, but I couldn't tell you who it was.
I like it. It's very familiar to me. I think it is by Mozart.
I'm pretty sure it's by Beethoven, but I don't know which one it is.
And I've heard the music on TV, background music, when I've gone to airports and things, on television commercials, that's where I've heard it before, but I think it's Vivaldi.
I would say it's probably the most recognisable, if not, yeah, that or Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.
This music was also a big hit when it was written in 1720, but then it slipped into oblivion for nearly 200 years. This is the story of the rediscovery of the Four Seasons and the man who composed them, Antonio Vivaldi. Mystery, intrigue and ambiguity are the essence of Venice and its ancient tradition of carnival. And they surround one of its most famous citizens, Antonio Vivaldi. Vivaldi was a priest who refused to say Mass. He was rumoured to be in a ménage à trois with 2 teenage girls. And despite celebrity and riches in his lifetime, he died in poverty. His extraordinary music slowly disappeared and might never have been heard again. So who was Antonio Vivaldi, and how did he fall into obscurity when, in his lifetime, he was such a colourful character? He stood out from his fellow Italians, not least because of his flaming red hair, which earned him the nickname of the Red Priest. He wrote passionate, dramatic, dangerous music. You know, if J.S. Bach was the Beatles of that era, Antonio Vivaldi was the Rolling Stones. Vivaldi was prolific. He wrote nearly 800 works for a very wide range of instruments. I'm just going to look at the Four Seasons, whose popularity both in Vivaldi's time and now is no accident. It's astonishingly vivid music which tells a story, and practically everyone on the planet has come across it in one form or another. But it might never have been heard again had it not been for an extraordinary musical find that catapulted him back into the public eye. My journey of rediscovery begins in Italy, but not in Venice. I'm retracing the footsteps of Alberto Gentili, lecturer in musical history at the University of Turin, who made one of the most unexpected and important musical discoveries of the 20th century when he came here over 70 years ago in 1927. This is the small sleepy town of San Martino, near Turin. Alberto Gentili was sent here to value a collection of music that was for sale at this school, the Collegio San Marco. At the time that Gentili entered the college, Vivaldi was only known to a few experts, and that was mainly because J.S. Bach, his contemporary, had incorporated some of Vivaldi's music into his own compositions. Vivaldi's music slowly disappeared after his death in 1741. Apart from a few musical experts, if anyone remembered him, it was as a freakish violinist and eccentric cleric, not as a composer at all. Vivaldi's music was the pop music of his day, and like any pop star now, he found it hard to stay at the top of the charts. In fact, it was even harder. There was no Radio 1 pumping out his music to keep it in the public consciousness, no CDs or tapes for his fans to buy. Most of his music wasn't even published. Often there'd just be one handwritten copy, so when the piece was no longer the hot new thing, it was easy to forget it and then lose it. So it's unsurprising that Vivaldi's music not only fell out of fashion, but disappeared altogether. Until this curtain was drawn back, and the door opened for Alberto Gentili. Gentili was given 97 volumes of music to look at, and 14 of them contained music by Vivaldi. 140 instrumental works, 29 cantatas, 12 operas, and an oratorio. It was an amazing find, but there was more excitement to come. When Gentili looked at the way the collection was numbered, he realized that half of it was missing. Then he had a brainwave. What if the collection were part of a split inheritance? His hunch turned out to be right. He tracked down the rest of the collection and persuaded the reluctant aristocratic owner to sell. Vivaldi, who'd been regarded by experts as a minor figure of the Baroque era, was about to become a major star. The Turin National Library is where these 27 volumes of Vivaldi's work are now kept. The most exciting thing about the collection is that there are plenty of compositional manuscripts. In other words, where he's composing straight from his head onto the page, with no prior sketches. They're stunning to look through. There's a little bit scrubbed out here. Occasionally he has a bad day and there are a few more corrections. But basically there are virtually no second thoughts or mistakes at all. I find it really moving looking at all of this. A man's musical life laid out in front of me. Just imagine how those musicologists must have felt when they were the first people to look at this material for the best part of 200 years. I think it's a bit like your first kiss. You know, you spend ages thinking about how it might be, chatting with your mates, and then finally it happens, and it's mind-blowing. The Four Seasons weren't part of this collection. They'd been gathering dust in other private vaults. But the new interest in Vivaldi meant they were dusted down and brought back to life in musical circles. But it was the arrival of the LP record in the 1950s that brought the Four Seasons to a wider audience. It's records such as these that have put the Four Seasons right at the top of the classical hit parade and made them stay there. So what is it about this music that so captured the public imagination, both at the time the pieces were written and now, almost 300 years later?
Thanks. This is my band, and together with our soloist, Cleo Gould, we're going to try and explore and unmask the four seasons, the four greatest concertos which tell a story ever written. When Vivaldi composed the four seasons, he also wrote 4 sonnets, one for each concerto. So take Spring, for instance. He took each line of the sonnets he'd written and actually applied them to the score very specifically to make it utterly clear what the music was describing. First it says, "Spring has arrived." And then the joyful birds welcome it with their happy songs. They're not the only ones who are happy. The brooks murmur sweetly at the arrival of spring. But all is not well. The sky darkens, and thunder and lightning proclaim a storm. Happily, the storm passes quickly enough, and the birds come back out again, twittering once again with their happy songs. Now, this is a violin concerto. In other words, a piece where you have a solo violinist and the orchestra are, most of the time, like the accompaniment to that soloist. The second movement has a sleeping goat herd, which is Cleo playing this beautiful, singing, soft and voluptuous line. Then, the second level of the painting Vivaldi's putting together is the murmuring of leaves. That's what the violins in the orchestra have to play. Then the third element to the picture, rather bizarre this, is that he's got a dog. The goat herd has a faithful dog who sits at his side, barking. I've reliably informed that Italian dogs go bow, bow, and in fact, the music Vivaldi writes is exactly that.
The Four Seasons is like a concept album, the 18th century equivalent to Pink Floyd's The Wall. But who was the man painting such vivid pictures with music? We're not even sure what he looked like. This is definitely a caricature of him. But is this a portrait of the flesh and blood man? Some experts think so because they believe the red patch on his forehead is a hint of Vivaldi's red hair. I just can't see this. Much more convincing to me is the violin, showing the sitter to be a performing musician, and the inkwell, which means he was also a composer. Vivaldi was born in Venice, supposedly in the middle of an earthquake. I was thrilled the man who wrote such tempestuous music should have been born among such elemental forces. But sadly, it's probably not true. Venice, despite its tranquil surface, is vulnerable to earthquakes, but there's no record of one on Vivaldi's birthday, which was the 4th of March, 1678.
Vivaldi was born right here. Well, not in this actual house, but on this spot. The date of his birth wasn't discovered until 1962, when his baptism certificate was unearthed. Very conveniently, that was right next door, here in the church of San Giovanni in Bragaro.
Vivaldi was the oldest son of a master barber who was also a violinist. Although Vivaldi ended up with 4 younger siblings, he was the only one who inherited his father's musical ability.
This book contains Vivaldi's baptism certificate, gives the date of the 6th of May 1678, and says that Antonio Lucio was born 4th March last and baptized at home, being in danger of death. And baptism here in church was just a formal version of what had already occurred at home. Why was he in danger of death? The earthquake made a nice story. The real reason is probably more to do with the illness that we know afflicted Vivaldi throughout his life, very bad asthma. And this asthma was probably the cause of many of the twists and turns, misunderstandings and scandals of his life.
For a start, asthma may be the reason Vivaldi became a priest. Vivaldi's mother apparently made a bargain with God. Her firstborn would become a priest if he lived long enough.
Vivaldi was ordained, no doubt because it was commonplace for families of humble origins to make their eldest son a priest. It was one career that offered social mobility. And also, he was so disabled by his asthma, there weren't really any trades open to him. But was Vivaldi a priest in his heart? Or was it just a convenient job he could exploit for the sake of his real career?
Venice has a strong effect on anyone who comes here. It's a glorious, romantic city, but then this is not its only face. It's also claustrophobic, smelly, and downright unnerving. But in any case, no one can argue with the fact that Venice bulges with sensual excess of every sort, and as such, it must have had a powerful influence upon Vivaldi and his music. How could it not have done? The Venice Vivaldi grew up in was not dissimilar to today. It was a city dependent on tourism. Its days as a trading centre and economic power had come to an end. If I was an early 18th century tourist doing what was known as the Grand Tour of Europe, I'd be looking to buy painting by Canaletto or music by Vivaldi as a memento of my stay in Venice. It does make today's holiday shopping look more than a little tawdry. In addition to buying souvenirs, tourists then, as now, wanted to go and see the hottest acts in town. A 1713 guidebook listed Vivaldi and his father as one of the main tourist attractions in Venice. Vivaldi's senior, Giovanni Battista, was the most important person in Antonio's life, kind of like the bedrock upon which his talent was able to flourish. And Dad acted like manager. He also helped Antonio raise money by copying out his music for him and selling it. The two of them lived and travelled together right up until Giovanni Battista's death, just 5 years before Antonio's. It seems to me their relationship wasn't unlike that between Mozart and his father some decades later, only perhaps just a little bit more easygoing. Vivaldi's father wrote one opera and was a good enough musician in his own right to be on the payroll as a violinist at the famous ducal church of St. Mark's. But Antonio was a brilliant violinist. As a result, he composed music that makes big demands of the violin soloist. Cleo and I met at the Café Florian in St. Mark's Square to talk about Vivaldi from a performer's point of view.
It's a piece that's it's got a lot of tricky movements, and I think you can tell that Vivaldi was himself a fabulous player by the fact that he chooses to put one of the most technically demanding passages almost immediately into the piece, which is really quite distressing when you're playing it, because you would normally want something of a warm-up, and most composers pace things so that you're not having kind of big demands made of you immediately, but he doesn't worry about that.
There's one extraordinary quote from someone who saw him play, who described his playing as being so ferocious and so kind of fireworky and pyrotechnical, but actually his fingers came within a straw's breadth of the bridge of the instrument. And what would that sound like on a modern instrument?
I've tried that, and the pitches that you would kind of get up to I mean, I can't really see where he would have been bowing, unless the bow was very thin, thinner than a straw, but it's kind of, you know, only a bat can hear it, really. So
there may have been a little bit of kind of like poetical license
well,
in the description.
maybe. I don't think that was probably within this piece. Funnily enough, he actually leaves almost nothing in the virtuoso style writing to the individual player to decide to do, because everything is written into the piece, with the exception of the slow movements, which are very sparse.
You can embellish them a bit.
You're kind of invited to do something with them. But he doesn't really leave a lot of room to just do your own thing and leave the score, because every note's filled in for you.
Which is interesting, because up until that time, composers had been generally fairly free and fairly happy to leave it to the discretion of the performer to embroider the work, hadn't they?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is quite unusual.
Vivaldi's extraordinary talent as a violinist got him a very important job, and this job was to be key to his development as a composer. In 1703, Vivaldi was engaged to teach violin in a refuge for illegitimate and abandoned children. Unwanted babies in Venice were frequently abandoned and sometimes even thrown into the canals. Eventually, 4 hospitals were set up to look after these children. 3 looked after orphans, street children and sick children, but only 1 looked after abandoned children, and that was called the Pietà, which means compassion. The babies were put through a hole in the wall known as the scaffetta. This one's been filled in and clearly wouldn't fit a baby now. But above it, there's a very stern warning which says, "The Lord God curses and excommunicates all those who send, or permit to be sent, their sons and daughters, whether legitimate or natural, to this hospital of the Pietà, when they have the means and the ability to raise them themselves." And it's signed by no less a representative of God on earth than Pope Paul III himself. The Pietà building still exists. It's an institute that deals with fostering and adoption. It even takes in abandoned children, but only about 4 a year, rather than the 4 a day that arrived in its heyday. Piled up in the corner of one of its rooms, there are many dusty documents, still revealing secrets about its past. Mickey White has devoted years to finding out more about Vivaldi and his pupils at the Pietà. This book is a register of all the abandoned children brought in between 1708 and 1719.
The majority of them died. And on the whole page we've got 8 entries. These crosses are the ones that died. Out of the 8 entries, 7 have died.
God, it's an enormous number.
Yeah. Now, I will show you one of these called Agata. And she was nascente, which means newborn. Now, from her entry, we can see that she was dressed very well. She's got red leggings. She's also dressed in lace, and she's got a note left with her saying that she has 1 finger on her left hand, and on her left foot she's got 1 toe. On her right foot she's got 3 toes. And she was left, obviously, because she was deformed. And you can tell by the entry that she is from a rich family.
And also given what she was wearing.
Exactly, that's right. Now, we come to another one, Marina, and you can see the difference in the entry. And Marina was 4 days old, and she was just wrapped in rags.
So this is a register basically of all the children that Vivaldi taught musical instruments to and then ultimately ended up composing for.
Well, no, he only taught the girls. The boys didn't do music. They were taught a trade like stone cutting, weaving, sail making, and then they were pushed out at about 16. And it was only the girls that did music.
This is really a unique opportunity for a composer to have a captive bunch of musicians.
It was incredible because he had all these girls at his disposal. that could play any instrument and sing.
So the Pieta are ordering or asking for new works from him all the time?
Oh, absolutely. When he was Maestro dei Concerti, he had to write 2 concertos a month. But Vivaldi wrote 2 concertos a week.
The concerts given by Vivaldi's girls became famous throughout Europe. Tourists flocked to hear them. And this is where they were mostly performed, the Pietà Church. This is the Pietà Church today, only this version of the church wasn't completed until after Vivaldi's death. But I can show you the exact spot where his concerts would have taken place. The original entrance to the church was right there, in what is now the Hotel Metropole. Although he was a great violinist, the fact that Vivaldi was a priest was key to him getting the job at the Pietà. It was a bit risky putting a man in with all the young women, but a priest, of course, was completely trustworthy. In my view, Vivaldi's music is full of subtext, and it's kind of easy to see why. Just imagine being a 26-year-old priest surrounded by scores of young women, many of them very talented. You could get quite hot under the collar thinking about this. And certainly for those watching the concerts, it was an almost erotic experience. These female musicians were hidden tantalizingly behind grilles, somewhere round about here, affording the audience an excellent opportunity to fantasize about whether they were as beautiful as their music. This is the description given by French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Vespers are performed in barred-off galleries solely by girls, of whom the oldest is not 20 years of age. I can conceive of nothing as voluptuous, as moving as this music. What grieved me were these accursed grilles, which allowed only tones to go through and concealed the angels of loveliness of whom they were worthy.
Even today, groups perform in the Pietà, dressed in 18th century costume, as a tribute to the famous concerts of Vivaldi's day. I suggested Cleo join this group, who call themselves the Music of Venice. Cleo, we don't want to play here. It's not the best place. The thing is, apparently Vivaldi is completed, but he did supervise the design of the acoustics. So, for instance, you can see there are no corners in the ceiling.
Well, where will we go then?
Well, we're going to go up there behind those grilles in that balcony. That's where the Pietà girls always played. Up to 32 people would cram in here. 16 instrumentalists and 16 singers. As you can see, it's a complete disaster. I mean, there's just not enough space to swing a cat up here. No idea how the Pietà girls were doing it for so long. So what do you think, Cleo? Is it feasible?
I don't think we should do the playing up here. I just think there isn't enough room, and I'm amazed that they managed to get so many musicians in here in Vivaldi's time.
Thing is, the acoustic is beautiful up here, isn't it? I mean, it feels
yes, it is.
Lovely. And I suppose you also have to remember that we're in a very different place from an 18th century concert-going public, particularly, I suppose, when it came to women instrumentalists. Women weren't really meant to play in public, and certainly not instruments as indelicate as the oboe. You know, if you play the oboe, you do look a bit like Tubby the Tuba or a beetroot. There's that kind of quality, and girls wouldn't want to be seen like that. Even worse, straddling a great big block of wood, which is a double bass.
Well, fair enough, but I don't think there's anything too shocking about playing the violin, so if you don't mind, I think we should do it down there.
On and off, Vivaldi spent 40 years of his life teaching and composing for the girls and women of the Pietà. But if they were half as beautiful as Rousseau imagined them to be, how did Vivaldi manage to resist them? Probably rather easily. Rousseau finally persuaded a friend who was an administrator at the Pietà to let him meet them.
He introduced me to one after another of those famous singers whose voices and names were known to me. Come, Sophie. She was horrible. Come, Katina. She was blind in one eye. Come, Bettina. The smallpox had disfigured her. Scarcely one was without some considerable blemish. I was desolate.
Very few of us are perfect, which could be the reason many Venetians wore masks when it wasn't the official carnival season. Certainly cheaper than a facelift. Masks gave Venetians a chance to live dangerously. For example, they were often worn in gaming houses and brothels. I could be worried that my association with Cleo might be misinterpreted, but not if we're both wearing masks. Cleo wanted to find out whether the real Vivaldi is at all like the man she thinks she knows through playing his music.
I've built up this idea of a person that's like a mass of contradictions, and sometimes he's so earthy and then sometimes he's so incredibly delicate and spiritual, and but he always seems to have this touch of humanity about him.
Well, let me unmask another side of Vivaldi to you. From his letters we know that he was really pushy and really pugnacious and had this obsession with controlling every aspect of his music. You can't really blame him for that, but I mean to such an extent that he'd sit there supervising the copyists who were writing out his music just to make sure that none of them did a copy on the sly which they could then sell and make some money themselves.
Gosh, I wouldn't have pinned him down as a control freak.
Well, you know, he had to be in a way because he obviously liked material pleasure. He lived a very nice life. I mean, look, here's his house coming up here. Can you imagine living in a house like that? As you know, musicians, certainly at that time, perhaps slightly less so now, were artisans. They were pretty low down the pecking order. So for someone to live as kind of flashily as that in a house like that was kind of amazing. And I think he probably put a lot of people's backs up as a result. But the fact is, he was a cult figure, so it's really hard for any of us to judge him. I mean, you either love or you hate a cult figure. You never just like him. From 1718 to 1720, Vivaldi left Venice and went 90 miles west to Mantua. He probably wanted to capitalize on his fame and take up some well-paid commissions. It was an escape from being in a gilded but claustrophobic cage. Mantua must have been a dramatic change for him. Open sky, greenery, a view for miles of flat, marshy countryside. Everything must have been a contrast to Venice. This is probably where he wrote the Four Seasons, but not for the reasons you might first think. Broadly speaking, I think the Four Seasons is a townie's take on the countryside. Deep down, the piece is anything but a celebration of things pastoral. To me, this terrain is the key to the more poisonous undertones of the work. It's flat and bleak, as you can see, hardly Tuscany. The sonnet that he wrote to accompany the music for summer is extremely bleak in its style. It talks about the men and the flocks languishing in the heat of the sun and the pine trees burning. An incredibly sort of deep torpor to the music. It's almost as if he was in a fever when he was writing it. What I mean, it's sort of broken. It's almost as if you can't breathe. There's no line, no lyrical line to find your way through. Another really important aspect, I think, is the choice of key. G minor is the key he chooses for summer, which is very unlikely given most people's impression of what summer is. Happiness, joyousness. G minor is one of the darkest keys. Anyhow, just as in the first movement of Spring, we get some relief in the form of birds. Here's the first one. Clearly enough, it's a cuckoo, and it's closely followed by a turtle dove, and finally a goldfinch. But then the winds, the north winds, come out to play, and this causes the shepherd extreme misery because he realizes that a storm is brewing. Constant unresolved harmony, harmony which just bleeds chromatically from one chord to the next without any sense of resolution. Finally, the winds come in battle, big time. Then in the second section, the slow movement, things get even more malign. This poor shepherd who's trying to rest, he's dying to rest, and he can't because now there's a swarm of flies, bluebottles, gnats, mosquitoes, and hornets to keep him company. You can hear his music, it's this listless theme that Cleo has, and the insects are in the violins. Just try the violins alone. That's lovely. Let's try that now with our listless shepherd over the top. I've always thought the slow movement's a bit of an asthmatic's view of summer. Hot, oppressive, difficult to breathe, gnats everywhere because of the marshland. The storm's threatening, but for Vivaldi, if it brought fresher air, then surely it was a blessed relief.
It's easy to overplay the relationship between nature and the four seasons. Nature may have very little to do with it at all. Just as likely an inspiration is exactly the opposite. What could be more full of man-made artifice than the opera? Vivaldi was obsessed with opera. He claimed to have written nearly 100 and put them on in theatres like this. It's likely he used the lessons he learnt from telling stories in opera to create the drama of the Four Seasons.
The Four Seasons are basically songs without words, which is lucky, really, because as you've probably noticed, the words aren't very good. When the threatened storm breaks at the end of summer, this is the text. The hail cuts down the lofty ears of corn, and the winds are in unbridled fury. Now, this style of writing and vocabulary certainly suggests that the words were by Vivaldi, but he added this line-by-line detail long after he'd finished writing the music. So why, you might find yourself asking, was he busy adding these rather coarse sonnets to music that had already been hugely successful? The answer is probably that he wanted to make his patron feel like he was getting something new when The Four Seasons was published 5 years after it had been written and first performed. The words then are inessential. It's the music that's important. me, this music is orgasmic. Stripping of corn, thunder and lightning, untold passion. Perhaps it's a metaphor for his relationship with Anna Giro. When Vivaldi was 48, he met a singer aged 16 or 17 who became his muse, his travelling companion. But what else was she? That's what I'd like to know. Vivaldi spent the rest of his life with Anna by his side. He insisted she star in all of his operas. Apparently, she didn't have a very good voice, but she made up for it with striking looks and great stage presence. Vivaldi certainly thought there was no one to match her. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but one person described her as having a delicate figure, beautiful eyes, lovely hair, and a charming mouth. There were rumours that Vivaldi not only had an affair with Anna, but also with her sister Paolina, who often acted as chaperone. Vivaldi didn't live with Anna. In fact, there's bags of evidence that wherever he lived, whenever he travelled, his father was with him, and more often than not, some of his many siblings to boot. This would have been probably because of his asthma. He couldn't walk any distance at all out of doors, so he had members of his family on hand to help him. Therefore, asthma is at the root of all his relationships. It's also, I think, at the heart of his music. Vivaldi's brilliant mind trapped in a sick body. The contrasts of shining clarity and distorting disease are central, I think, to the Four Seasons, and especially in the slow movements. The sonnet for the second movement of Autumn describes the sweet slumber of some drunken peasants. But to me, this music, even more than in summer, is about constriction, suffocation. Each asphyxiated chord denied the oxygen of resolution. The third movement of Autumn is a hunt, and to be honest, it's pretty much like a manifesto for the anti-hunt lobby, and it's got this incredibly club-footed, banal kind of tune which keeps on coming back and coming back and coming back, and you get this picture of these very unpleasant, cruel men going off on these mangy horses and these disgusting dogs to find some innocent beast to kill. With this music here that Cleo takes off, it's a new triplety figure in very fast runs, which is the beast fleeing, terrified from these animals and men. Rising chords you can hear there in the orchestra, rising chromatically, a semitone at a time, upping the pressure on the poor beast as the hounds and the horses close in around him. Now they really mean business. We start to get real gunshots coming out of the orchestra here. And we've taken a bit of poetic license. We've added some pizzicato, some plucking of strings to add to the bowed sound as well. Let's play from that first set of gunshots. sound there, that very fast figure that the whole orchestra have, sounds to all the world like a bunch of hounds actually sniggering, laughing, like Muttley. Do you remember Muttley? It's that kind of quality. Let's try it with as much grain in the sound as possible. And you hear that falling figure that Cleo has there? That is the beast, finally giving up. It's been so terrified, it's run and run and run, it's now exhausted, and it dies. The hounds, meanwhile, carry on laughing. And the final insult on behalf of the hunt, they say, "Do we care?" What I love about Vivaldi's writing in the Four Seasons is that it brims with conviction. It's sensual, vulgar, savage, and extremely flamboyant. Now, these aren't the obvious adjectives you'd associate with a servant of God. Still the same question, was Vivaldi really a committed priest? Or did he take holy orders as a convenient career to combine with his musical ambitions? His relationship with the church was hardly scandal-free.
One of the key tasks of a Catholic priest is to say Mass. Yet Vivaldi only said it for a year after being ordained. Rumours flew around that in the middle of Mass he was sneaking into the vestry to jot down bits of music. Vivaldi later claimed it was because of his asthma, and given the smoky incense, this could be true. But he pursued his musical career with tireless energy, so it seems to me it was just a convenient excuse. The gossip about Vivaldi began to have serious consequences. At the age of nearly 60, he wanted to put on an opera in Ferrara, not far from Venice. But instead, in November 1737, he was summoned to a meeting with the Pope's Venetian representative. It was here the papal nuncio told Vivaldi that he couldn't enter Ferrara to put on his opera. The Archbishop of Ferrara had imposed the ban because of Vivaldi's refusal to say Mass and because of his friendship with Anna Giro. So, my doubts that Vivaldi was a committed priest and a virgin seem to have powerful support. But the Archbishop of Ferrara had banned all priests under his jurisdiction from acting as opera impresarios. It wasn't just Vivaldi. Saying that the ban was because of Vivaldi's refusal to say Mass and his relationship with Anna Giro was probably just a way of putting down a priest who'd become a little bit too big for his boots. After all, Vivaldi's behaviour certainly flattered the spirit, if not the letter, of the law. Whatever the reasons behind the ban, Vivaldi never made it to Ferrara. Not long before, his father had died, and Vivaldi seems to have been lost without him. He began to have financial problems when his opera investments failed. His music fell out of fashion, and the popular star became yesterday's news. So we're now very much in the winter of Vivaldi's life. And funny enough, winter is my favourite of the four concertos. I think it's mainly because of the choice of key. It's F minor, which is a tremendously potent key. It's rich, but at the same time it can be very, very cold and metallic. There's a technique in string playing called sul ponticello, which means that you play with the bow right over the bridge to get a particularly grainy, visceral, metallic sound. Robin, perhaps you could play us those F naturals, how they would sound if you played them normally. Right, now play over the bridge. The next thing that happens is that there's an icy blast of wind, just to further disconcert everyone.
solo violin has music which is meant to sound like, and absolutely does sound like, someone's teeth chattering. Finally, we get this tremendously robust music, which is effectively someone stamping their lifeless feet to get some blood running back into them.
This is one of the canals that leads to the open sea, a way of leaving Venice, which is exactly what Vivaldi did in 1740 at the age of 62. His work opportunities had dried up, and whilst there's no record of what happened to him for a year, we know he ended up in Vienna in June 1741. He died a month later, on the 27th of July, from what was described as an internal inflammation.
Anna was there, so he didn't die alone. News reached Venice over a month later. A local report said,
Abbe Don Antonio Vivaldi, incomparable virtuoso of the violin, known as the Red Priest, much esteemed for his compositions and concertos, earned more than 50,000 ducats in his life, but his disorderly prodigality caused him to die a pauper.
It's very clear to me, whatever the reality of Vivaldi's life, that within the music lies the heart, the unconscious inner feelings of this turbulent priest. If you read the sonnet which accompanies that, the slow movement of Winter, it'll tell you it's about a man sitting cozy as can be inside in front of the fire, watching the rain outside and those less fortunate than him. It has a kind of a smugness about it, which makes me feel that actually Vivaldi is not the man inside in the little armchair toasting his toes. He's the guy outside looking in. He is the outsider. You will have heard the rain very clearly in that, this pizzicato that the violins have. So you've got that going on underneath Cleo's line, which presumably is the deliciously warm man. And then you have this extra little piece of tension which is coming out of Robin on the cello. The final movement of Winter, the final concerto of the Four Seasons, is about walking on the ice. And in fact, the Venetian lagoon froze over 10 years or so before Vivaldi wrote the Four Seasons, so that may have been a direct inspiration for it. But again, to me, it's much more about Vivaldi himself. Here's a man who'd ducked and dived all of his life. At the end of his life, he was a very poor, broken man, trying constantly not to fall over on the ice. And in that sense, it's a bit like his epitaph.